So, the final part of the lecture on why Weimar Germany is in trouble is for us to look at weaknesses of the constitution. So they are separate from the Treaty of Versailles in your argument if you're doing this in a 16 marker about what the biggest problems were. Okay, these are nothing to do with the Treaty of Versailles. The Weimar Constitution was set up separately to it. But I will talk about, when I go on to talk about the conclusion in a minute, I'll talk about how you can link it back to the Treaty of Versailles, to make sure you have a very coherent argument and get the full 16 marks. So, first of all, there are some strengths to the Weimar Constitution. Okay, this isn't relevant if you're talking about the weaknesses, but we should throw it in here just in case, because you need to know it if you get it in a 9 mark or a 12 mark or something. So, one strength that the Constitution had is that it had a strong president. The president could rule in an emergency by using something called Article 48. Okay, so the 48th article of the Constitution, or set of laws in which they used to rule the country, it stated that the president could rule if there was an emergency. He could overrule the Weimar Government and the Reichstag and so on. This was good because it meant he was strong and could actually organise the country. It is also very fair. Now, proportional representation, it's unlikely you're going to have to go into huge amounts of depth, but if you're going for an A and A star, you really should be thinking about understanding that in a bit more depth, and it will be very helpful if you go on to study A-level. Some of the courses at A-level, it'll be very helpful too, so it's worth knowing and understanding, but the crux of it is that proportional representation means you get a proportional amount of seats in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament, proportional to how many votes you get. Okay, so it's not based upon where you are when you vote or anything like that, or voting for a particular MP. It's just literally, if you get X number of seats, X number of votes, your party will be given Y number of seats. Okay. Now, that's about 80,000. So it was about 80,000 votes, I think, to get one seat. So you get 100,000 votes, you get 10 seats, and so on. So the overall way in which this was fair was because regardless of who you were, you could vote for who you wanted to, and your vote would be reflected in exactly the same way as everybody else. You could be an 18-year-old woman and your vote is worth the same as a 72-year-old man, or a 36-year-old woman, or somebody that lives in Bavaria, or somebody that lives in Munich. It made no difference. Okay, and I mentioned their genders. The voting rights were equal, men and women. So this is the most democratic, directly, clearly democratic form of government. You get who you, as a group of people, vote for. Okay? None of the complications that you get in an American or British system where somebody can be voted in with fewer votes. They just get the votes in the right places. However, there is corresponding weakness to every strength there. So the corresponding weakness to the president being strong is that he was actually too strong. He was elected every 7 years. He selected a chancellor and he was very hard to remove. So if you voted somebody in who wasn't really doing a very good job, or as was the case of Hindenburg later on, was very, very old and didn't really have the power to do very much, you couldn't do much about getting rid of him, apart from wait for him to die. Anyway, Article 48 was overused, particularly after later on and after the Wall Street crash, which we'll talk about at a later date. But on this case, Article 48 did undermine the democratic system of being able to vote for a government, because they wouldn't necessarily be able to do anything. One of the main reasons they wouldn't be able to do anything, aside from the the president overruling them, was because of proportional representation. So here's the corresponding negative. If you can vote for whoever you want, smaller parties can get seats and can disrupt the government. There were parties such as the Nazis and the communists and so on who didn't believe in the concept of democracy. So they could sit there in parliament, they only have to get 80,000 people to vote for them to get one seat, in a country of 50, 60 million, and they could get that seat and they could disrupt, they could shout, and they could just get in the way and be irritating. But also it led to coalition governments. So there was lots of parties that got sort of 20 seats or 5 seats or 56 seats, that kind of thing. And these were not going to be able to form their own governments, but they could be very, very important if, let's say, the Social Democrats, who had let's go with 30 or 40%, depending on which election we're looking at, of the seats, they could ask for their help, and then they become very powerful within a coalition because they have to agree to things, which makes it very, very weak. Because let's say the Catholic Centre Party agrees to join with the Social Democrats to help run the government. The Social Democrats want to pass something very un-Catholic, like I don't know, it's not a relevant one, but just to give an example, if they decided suddenly that they wanted to make it easy to get an abortion, the Catholics may leave that, even if they agree on economic issues. They might just leave it on social issues, and then the coalition fails, and they have to start all over again and probably go to the polls again. And then in the meantime, anything could be going on. Okay, and in the meantime, whenever there was a discussion or dispute between the parties, Hitler and other parties who were extreme could basically say, look, if you vote for us, none of this would happen, because we'd have a clear leader, a clear ruler, and we would sort all of the problems out. Okay, and ultimately, many people will still tell you today that the reason Hitler came to power, one of the main reasons, is because of proportional representation, because he wouldn't have had that level of interest in him had they run it under a different system. Okay, so that's constitutional weaknesses. Now, how has that got anything to do with the Treaty of Versailles, you may ask? Well, I'm going to talk now very briefly about how you would conclude this essay. So to remind you, what we started at the beginning of part one of this lecture, we were looking at if the question is something like the Treaty of Versailles is the most important problem Germany had during this period, to what extent do you agree, or Germany was doomed to fail from the start, or the weakness of the constitution was the most important reason, I would suggest that you argue it's the Treaty of Versailles, because you can link everything else back into it. So let's start with the weakness of the constitution, because that's what we've just been discussing. Now, I would just simply use the word exacerbated. Okay, if you use the word exacerbated, which means to make worse, you can link it back into the Treaty of Versailles very easily. Now, the constitution was not strong, but in having the Treaty of Versailles passed, it made the government, the Weimar government, look even weaker, because they couldn't agree over things. They were struggling with hyperinflation and tax on Freikorps and so on and so forth. Had they not have been in the situation where they're having to respond to this terrible diktat of the Treaty of Versailles, diktat means it's been imposed upon them, then they may have been able to come up with a more clear way, or more clear kind of like party lines, where you have 2 or 3 big parties, and then they decide on coalitions. Remember, Germany runs proportional representation today and does just fine. It's a successful democracy today. It was the stresses and strains of the Treaty of Versailles and reactions to it that meant A, extremist parties were overrepresented in the Reichstag, and B, there were too many differences of opinion and too much negativity surrounding the parties that wanted to run Germany fairly kind of like moderately, fairly clearly, I suppose. So that's how you link this weakness of constitution. So Treaty of Versailles is a more significant cause than the weakness of constitution, because it exacerbated the difficulties of running Germany under proportional representation. Then you can say that the Treaty of Versailles led on to the other two. So without the Treaty of Versailles, there would not have been the Kapp Putsch. The Kapp Putsch wouldn't have happened because his main way of getting support, his main argument was that the government was weak because they'd stabbed the army in the back and then signed the Treaty of Versailles. And that also then links into the stab in the back myth and why it's more important than that one. And finally, hyperinflation. Germany probably wouldn't have done all of the printing of the money and sort of had this panic-laden way of dealing with the economy and economic problems if they hadn't have had to pay such significant reparations. Just a reminder about the Spartacist uprising. I didn't mention it there because it's not related to the Treaty of Versailles. So you probably wouldn't want to put it, even if you've mentioned it in your essay, you probably wouldn't want to go on about it in your conclusion because it will distract you from your coherent argument. So overall, in conclusion, the Treaty of Versailles was the most significant problem in Germany because it either caused the other problems directly or it exacerbated them. and made them seem to be more significant problems.